It is time to start, so we'll start with a little bit of good news today. Turn it up. Is that better? Does that make a difference? All right, so some good news to start with. Last night, there was a basketball game here in Stanfield, and I'm thinking of the boys' game. The girls won as well, but the boys' varsity team beat Heppner. And you know, we don't beat Heppner all that often. In football, it's a once-a-decade occurrence. In basketball, it's not quite as lopsided. We do beat Heppner from time to time, but they are the team usually to beat in most sports. And we played them a month or so ago in Heppner. I was at that game, and I just hung my head in shame. Because they beat us. They beat us by over 20 points. But the reason it wasn't worse is because most of the fourth quarter they played the second stringers, and our second stringers did pretty well, so we actually caught up some. But last night it was a totally different game, and we beat Heppner, and it was an all-team effort. I mean, they played with great determination and grit. And the Heppner fans, it was so enjoyable to watch their stunned expressions as they were leaving the gym. Just wanted to say to them, "Suffer, baby." And so the other thing that was interesting is that so the Heppner fans, they really were stunned and just taken aback. They were ranked 9th in state. They were undefeated in league, and now I think they're 7-1, and we're 7-1. So 8-1, okay. So they were stunned, and you could see the expressions on their faces. The other thing that was sad to see was that I have some relatives, and they got confused on the start time. And so Harry and Barbara showed up with about 2 minutes left in the fourth quarter. And I kid you not, the stunned expression on Barbara's face, it was really noticeable. You know, stunned and like, what happened, and we missed the whole game. And your grandson had a phenomenal first quarter, and then the second quarter, our whole team just like, wow, terrible. And at halftime, we were up by 2, and they came out. The whole momentum was with them going into halftime, and the second half was just the whole Stanfield team just played really, really hard and really, really well. It was fun. So 61-55, I think, was the final score. So, all right.
Is voting a sin?
I don't know. Well, am I gloating? Is that what you would say? I mean, I guess I am gloating to say that "suffer, baby, suffer." I don't have anything against Heppner. I mean, it's a nice community. But I remember years ago when we played, I remember, when we had Dylan Grogan and some of those guys, we beat Heppner quite a bit. But even in football, some of the best football teams Stanfield's ever had, it's a real feat to beat Heppner in football.
So John, who was it that made 11 of the first 13 points?
Well, Hobbs he made 11 of the first 13 points. And then they started really keying on him. He had 16, I think, in the game. But yeah, he had a good game. But I mean, there were a lot of guys on that team last night who had good games. And it was a real team effort. And they had some of the guys that don't necessarily score a lot of points, but guys who played big and played well. Heppner's a much bigger team than us, so with this one guy who's on our team who's got some size to him, and I've never seen him play with just the determination. I went up and told him afterwards, I said, you played like a man tonight. I mean, big rebounds and good assists and hitting some free throws and just doing a lot of those little things that you got to do to beat a good team. So it was really fun. Even Maria, who does not have the sports gene, is, I think, enjoying some of these games. So, all right, well now, since the good news is beyond us, we'll talk about life. And there are two things that I'll update today about. They're actually the same issue. The first one is coming out of West Lafayette, Indiana, which I don't know a lot about West Lafayette, Indiana. I did look it up, though, on Wikipedia. Is that Wikipedia, right? That's what they call that? To find out a little information about the community. And what I read there is that, of course, it's a Midwest town, so it's in what we call flyover country. We've got the West Coast, the East Coast, where the elites tend to live, and then you got flyover country. That's a phrase, it's a derogatory phrase that was coined by people living in those elite places. You know, you just fly over, why would you want to stop? But of course, a lot of America is in so-called flyover country, and this community, West Lafayette, Indiana, is there. It has a population of 45,000 people. So it is a pretty small community, isn't it? I mean, Hermiston's pushing 20,000. So it's double Hermiston and a few more. However, there is something else in this community that does very much influence, I think, the way the community functions, the way the community thinks, the worldview within the community, and that is the presence of a major research university. And so Purdue University is situated in this community, and that also, of course, adds to their population, at least during the school year, because it adds 40,000 students and faculty and staff, and so that the community of Purdue University is around 40,000 individuals. So a town of 45,000 people with a major university of around 40,000, what does that sound a little bit like? Particularly since Purdue is an ag school, and Corvallis, it's a lot like Corvallis, isn't it? I mean, Oregon State's not 40,000, it might be 25,000, I don't know what it is, but it's a major university, and Corvallis is a community probably around the size of this town in Indiana. So that's the community. They of course, have a city council, and that city council, like city councils everywhere, make decisions and have policies. So, then the third point here I want to make is that there's of course our churches in this community, as you would imagine, probably quite a few churches. One of them is called Faith Church in West Lafayette, and for the past 45 years, this church has operated a free biblical counseling ministry for members of the community. So they're not the people involved in this ministry through Faith Church in West Lafayette. They're not professional counselors. They don't have master's degrees or doctoral degrees in counseling, but they have been trained how to counsel, and specifically from a biblical perspective. And in reading about some of this, I get the impression that this particular church has actually chosen not to pursue a more secular approach to counseling or accreditation or degrees from secular schools and so forth, because they view their counseling ministry not through that worldview or that paradigm, but specifically they want to do counseling from a thoroughly biblical worldview perspective. So are you with me? So we've got this community, relatively small community with a major research university in flyover country, and there's churches in this community, and one of these churches has, for 45 years, a large counseling ministry that's helped the community. They don't charge to do any of this. I think other churches are involved in this ministry as well. Now, enter the city council. The city council is going to vote, or at least it's under consideration. I think that's probably the accurate way to put it. A city ordinance entitled 3121, and it's not new. It's been tabled a few times, but it's back up in front of the council, and there's a desire to pass this ordinance. And this ordinance would prohibit unlicensed biblical counselors from providing counsel to minors. So anyone under the age of 18, minors who are struggling with same-sex desires and want help for dealing with those desires. Okay? I have the ordinance in front of me, and I think I'll take the time just to read some of this to you. I've underlined parts that I thought were of most interest. It begins this way, ordinance number 3121. Whereas contemporary science recognizes that being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender is part of the natural spectrum of human identity and is not a disease, disorder, or illness. Now, I'm just going to read these and just ask if you have any comments or response. From a Christian worldview, what would be perhaps a problem you would have with the statement I just read?
Says who?
Says who?
Well, just from my Christian point of view, from a scholarly point of view, that statement would not be true 20 years ago.
That's absolutely true. It would not be true 20 or 25 years ago. I don't know exactly, when all those changes were made within the manuals of the psychological associations and so forth. But yes, a few decades ago, even in the secular realm, these behaviors were classified as disorders. Now they're being classified as part of the natural spectrum of human identity. The word that's missing in all of this, and of course this is coming from a very secular worldview, but the word that's missing is sin. Okay? That there's no room for sin. And the Catholic Church in particular talks about disordered desires. Are you familiar with disordered desires? I mean intimately familiar. All of you are. I'm sure of that. Have you ever had a disordered desire? It doesn't have to be in the sexual realm. Maybe you coveted something that's not rightfully yours. Or you had a desire to tell a juicy piece of gossip that you knew you shouldn't share. Or it might be that you had a desire that is in the sexual realm. These are called disordered desires because they're disordered. They're not healthy, they're not natural, they're not right, they're not moral. And so we have disordered desires. Well, you tell me, why do we have disordered desires? Total depravity. Yeah, the sinfulness of the human heart. And until very recently, everybody, I think, in culture recognized that fundamental reality, that there's something called sinful desire, and that we all struggle with that. But there's no room for that category any longer in the secular worldview, and so that's entirely missing from this. Let me read another statement that's making the same kind of idea, the category of sin, just there's no room for it. Whereas, so now they start to quote the experts, not telling you that the experts have changed their manuals over the last several decades. Whereas the American Association of Sexuality Educators, that's an interesting phrase, don't you think? The American Association of Sexuality Educators. What are they up to, do you think? counselors and therapists in 2017 stated that, quote, having a non-heterosexual sexual orientation, that being transgender and that being gender non-conforming, are not mental disorders. We oppose any reparative or conversion therapy that seeks to change or fix a person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. AASECT, that stands for the American Association of Sexuality Educators and Counselors, does not believe that non-heterosexual sexual orientation or being transgender or gender non-conforming is something that needs to be fixed or changed. Now again, there's no room for sin in this, and there's no room for repentance. Because from a Christian worldview perspective, you would say that individuals who are living this way and engaged in this kind of activity, the need is repentance. But of course, not just for them, right? The need of the world is repentance. And not to deny that there are people who struggle with disordered desires. That's a category that's true, and it makes sense, and we need to acknowledge that. But we need to also acknowledge that from a biblical Christian worldview, these are disordered desires. There is still a category called sinful desires. And the response is not to say that those desires are good and normal and natural. The response is those are sinful desires that need to be repented of and struggled against. Well, I'm skipping down here quite a ways. Whereas the city of West Lafayette, Indiana, has a compelling interest in protecting the physical and psychological well-being of minors, including lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth, and in protecting its minors against exposure to serious harm caused by conversion therapy by unlicensed persons. And so I write here, the justification is protecting LGBTQ minors from harm. But again, from a Christian worldview, we would say truth, wouldn't we? That this ordinance is trying to protect these individuals from truth. So the policy shields minors from biblical truth. Now, I'm skipping again, conversion therapy. So how is that defined? Because that's relevant, particularly the way that conversion therapy is often today defined in the secular media. It's defined in ways that are not relevant to what is actually done by a counselor or a therapist. There are examples from the past where electric shock therapy was used, for instance, with people with same-sex attraction. We would not agree with that, in the same sense that we would not tend to agree that electric shock therapy should be used to treat all sorts of other things in the mental health realm, and it was, okay? So how do they define conversion therapy? That's significant and relevant. If they define it in terms of there are terrible things being done to these people, then, well, maybe this would make sense. But that's not how it's defined. This is their own document. Conversion therapy is defined as any practices or treatments. Now, the word any matters there. Any practices or treatments that seek to change an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity, including efforts to change gender expressions or to eliminate or reduce sexual or romantic attractions or feelings towards individuals of the same gender. And it goes on, there's another paragraph here. But again, what's lacking in this is just the realization that you might have romantic attractions to another person, and frankly, you might struggle with that for your entire life, and you might never be able to overcome those attractions. But still, from a biblical worldview perspective, those are disordered desires, and they're not to be yielded to. It's not to be said that this is good and healthy and normal. Pursue this, because from a biblical worldview, where does it lead? To destruction. So, we're concerned about people's souls, and we actually believe in God. So again, conversion therapy is defined as any practice or treatment that seeks to help a person move out of that lifestyle. So you have someone who is struggling with this, someone who doesn't want to embrace it, someone who doesn't want to live that way, and they come to the church, Faith Church in West Lafayette, and they say, I know that you have a counseling ministry, and here's my issue, I want help. And this ordinance is saying that that church cannot help that individual unless it is to affirm them in their orientation and in that lifestyle. Skipping again down, the city of West Lafayette strongly discourages licensed persons from engaging in conversion therapy with a minor person. I read that to you because just to point out that this ordinance is specifically targeting this non-licensed group of counselors associated with this particular church. So in other words, and they say that here, they say if you're a licensed counselor, we don't think you should be trying to change these individuals or help these individuals or counsel them against living that lifestyle. But all we're saying here is we discourage that. But if you're non-licensed, namely if you're part of that church, we're going after you. Okay? So this is an attack on the Christian worldview specifically, and it's an attack on religious liberty. So unlicensed persons, here's their next statement, it shall be a violation of this ordinance for an unlicensed person to engage in conversion therapy with a minor person. And then section 4, enforcement. Any violation of this ordinance shall result in a fine of $1,000. A separate offense shall be deemed committed on each day that a violation occurs or continues. So if you meet with a young person 5 times and they find out and this ordinance in place, you're going to get a $1,000 fine for each of those meetings. And there's some question in terms of this. Okay, an unlicensed person who tells a minor, don't go this way, don't live this way. What might fit into the category of an unlicensed person saying that? A parent. And so there's a real question based on how this is written. Could this actually be used against parents who are simply telling their sons and daughters, this is not God's best for your life? And so that's right now, it's very current. This is going to be on their agenda for February 7th. Perhaps not surprising, there are members of this city council, there are 7 or 9 individuals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there's 9 of them, and some of them are they're part of the LGBTQ plus community. Probably not surprising, right? And it's a good reminder to us of something we see over and over again. Local issues do matter. City councils matter, school boards matter, and that community seems to be so overrepresented in those positions of influence. And it makes you think that there's something intentional about that as sort of a policy.
That church will probably get targeted just like the baker and the florist and...
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, what happens there, if it happens, won't stay there, right? It'll go other places. And this is in Indiana, in a smallish community.
So when I listened to a podcast several months ago that talked about the Canadian law of this.
We're going to talk about that in a moment.
The guy that was doing the podcast said, well, we're protected in America because we have the First Amendment freedom of speech. Doesn't that walk all over our Constitution?
Well, yes, I think this ordinance is a violation of religious liberty. And it's, yes, it's basically saying the only worldview that we will allow is our worldview. If you have a different worldview, if you see the world differently, if you have a different set of convictions and beliefs, you do not have the freedom to live out of those convictions and those beliefs. And so it's intolerant, and it's moving in the direction of being totalitarian. Totalitarianism is a worldview that encompasses everything. It's all encompassing. There's no freedom left for a contrary opinion or viewpoint. And so much of this makes you think in those terms. There is just no room left for freedom of conscience and freedom of conviction, and for simply saying, I might be wrong, but I don't agree with you, and I'm not planning to agree with you, and I should have the freedom to be wrong. Okay? But increasing in our society, that freedom is simply no longer available to us. Now, of course, they would say, well, this is doing so much damage and so much harm. And we would simply say, I don't think so. I don't agree with that. I don't submit to that interpretation of reality. And ultimately, from a biblical perspective, if we believe our worldview, to tell people in the LGBTQ plus community that everything is good and you should pursue this and live this, even though God will judge you for this, to the detriment of your eternal soul. We can't do that, can we? So.
Nor does it seem to be the best for those people. I mean, I think there's a lot of internal issues that it creates. I mean, it's very uncompassionate to the person, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think you can make that.
In that regard.
I think you can make that kind of an argument, because really the secular culture is lying to people, and lying is ultimately not compassionate and not for their best.
The words that you spoke there, that saying they're protecting the minors from serious harm. And if we think about that, just the stats that you've given us earlier, about how many of these people that go through the body mutilation, through the counseling to accept the transgenderism, are subjecting themselves to suicide.
Yeah.
And is suicide a disordered desire?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and specifically with the transgender movement, where there is so much pressure to put young kids on cross-sex hormones, to allow young kids to make decisions for themselves without their parents' knowledge, and even really pressure to have surgical things available for young kids. And of course, this ordinance I read to you, the point of that, it's minors, right? That ordinance does not say that if you're a 43-year-old male that you can't go to this church and let them talk to you. It's saying if you're a minor, you can't. And with the transgender issue, from what I understand, I'm thinking like grade school age kids, that 80% of them will outgrow gender confusion if they are guided, lovingly directed to affirm their biological sex. 80% of them will go, what we would say is in the right direction. And I think that will be for them will lead to much greater emotional health, much better outcomes for them. But if you've got a bunch of ideologues who are taking a young person who comes and says, I have some confusion here, and pushes them down that transgender road, gets them on cross-sex hormones, eventually leads to surgical procedures. There are real horror stories in the literature of people who now deeply regret the decisions that they made and are furiously angry with therapists, clinics, physicians, educators, and counselors. And these are now victims, and they feel like I was a young person manipulated by adults who had an agenda, and it really wasn't for my best.
Problem is the schools can help the kids walk them through being whatever the heck they're claiming to be. And if the parents try to step in and point them in the way that they need to be pointed, the parents are the ones that have to suffer for it and get put in jail.
Yeah, well, and the parents are considered oppressors and haters, and yeah. Now, not to deny that in the transgender world, the suicide rate is 40%. So there are...
Transition.
Yes, transition in many instances does not alleviate the anxiety they feel. In some it does, from what I understand. And so if you're 40 years old and you want to transition, I mean, that is a different scenario. But we're doing things to very young people, very young bodies, and it just shouldn't be. Oh, let me say something about the Canadian bill, because what's in Canada doesn't always stay in Canada. This is Bill C4, the House of Commons. First session, the 44th Parliament, the year 2021, December 1st, 2021. This is the legislation that I have in front of me. And again, I'm not going to read all of this to you, but I'm going to read just a few pieces of this. Here's part of the preamble. And this is outlawing conversion therapy. Conversion therapy causes harm to society because, among other things, it is based on and propagates myths and stereotypes about sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, including the myth that heterosexuality, cisgender gender identity, and gender expression that conforms to the sex assigned to a person at birth are to be preferred over other sexual orientations, gender identities, and gender expressions. Do you follow that? It's kind of complicated, isn't it? The sex assigned at birth, that doesn't mean assigned by God. That doesn't mean that the baby is born and you look at the baby and you realize God has assigned a sex to this baby, and so you say it's a girl or it's a boy. No, what this means, the sex assigned at birth, is the doctor said it's a girl or a boy. But of course the doctor shouldn't say that, because the doctor could be profoundly misinformed. Okay? So yes, we should just say it's a baby. And the paragraph is saying that there should be no preference given basically to biological realities. And whereas in light of those harms, that we make these determinations, that we say it's a boy, it's a girl, or we say that heterosexuality is just a myth in terms of an identity, I guess, or a preferred identity at least. Whereas in light of those harms, it is important to discourage and denounce the provision of conversion therapy in order to protect the human dignity and equality of all Canadians. And then I want to read just another section of this, and you realize that this is This is part of a bill that's they're taking existing legislation and they're adding to it, and they're modifying it, and they're like updating it. But what's interesting here, and you have this language over and over and over, it's throughout this document, where they are lumping in conversion therapy with other things that should not be allowed and have been banned. And so conversion therapy is being attached to this list of other things. So I want to read to you the list of other things. This is under well, let me just read this. The owner and maker of the matter, seized under subsection 1 and alleged to be obscene. So here's the list of obscene things. Child pornography, a voyeuristic recording, an intimate image, an advertisement of sexual services, or an advertisement for conversion therapy. And you have that statement or similar statements made over and over as you read through the documents in these various paragraphs. So again, they're saying that conversion therapy is lumped in with pedophilia and pornography. I mean, illegal pornography, so much of it, is pretty acceptable in our culture today. But conversion therapy should be thought of in those terms as something that's truly heinous and evil.
So maybe I'm missing a note here, but there are a couple library books out that are controversial. One's called Lawn Boy, and that's been off, or that's what do you call it? I can't think of the word for a young person having pedophilia. And so how? And then there's another one called Gender Happy or something like that.
Yeah, this is Canada. The books you're referring to have been in American public high school libraries.
Do you not think they crossed the border? Those books?
Oh, I think they absolutely have. I think those books should be removed from the libraries.
But doesn't that apply into what you just read?
So you're suggesting these people are being inconsistent? Yeah. And you apparently have a problem with that. Okay. So in other words, those books which promote homosexual pedophilia behaviors, and I know there's been a number of different instances of this, and I don't know how all of them have played out, but I do know in one of the situations they were removed because a mother came to a school board meeting with the books and just started reading them in the school board meeting, and she was shut down by the school board because it was embarrassing and it was inappropriate. The material was, and so the school board removed those books, and then the school board put those books back in the library. So yes, that is a reality, and it just shows the hypocrisy of some of this. Okay? So I'm skipping down here. Conversion therapy, they also are seeking to define what they mean by the term. So they have a section 320.101, a definition of conversion therapy. Conversion therapy means a practice, a treatment, or a service designed to change a person's sexual orientation to heterosexual, change a person's gender identity to cisgender. Now, those are interesting words, particularly like cisgender. If you were to take this document back, I don't know how long, but not very long ago, maybe even 10 years ago, and hand this to the parliamentarian in Canada and to the members of parliament, I assume they would read the word cisgender and wouldn't even know what it means. Now, to change a person's sexual orientation to heterosexual, I'm not even sure that's realistic, honestly. There are people who've lived a homosexual lifestyle who've come out of it, who've gotten married to a person of the opposite gender, done well, and seemed happy. One of them would be Rosaria Butterfield, if you've read her story. If you haven't read her story, it's really worth reading. Her little book is entitled An Unlikely Convert. I think it's that, or something very similar to that. It's Rosaria Butterfield. Why do you think her parents named her Rosaria? What religion does that make you think of, Rosaria? The Rosary. Yeah. She grew up Catholic in a good home, I believe. I'm trying to remember now, I read the book years ago. She eventually became a professor at Syracuse University. She was an English major, had her PhD in English literature, but she ended up running the gender women's studies program at Syracuse University, so a major research university. And her story, An Unlikely Convert, is a compelling read of the process by which she eventually left that lifestyle. So she was a lesbian, had a partner. I don't think they were married, because this was before the legalization. And now she is married to a man who happens to be a conservative, Reformed, Presbyterian pastor, and is an adoptive mother. Was, I think, beyond the age of childbirth, when she came out of that lifestyle. So she's an example of someone who was thoroughly immersed in that lifestyle and has come out of it and has found joy and contentment in a biblical marriage. Some people, that might not be possible, that the desires are so strong that they're never going to overcome the desires. So conversion therapy has been defined here in a very narrow kind of way, as if every person can change their identity. And I think from my perspective and from a biblical perspective, that's the definition here is just wrong. We should be talking about therapies or counseling that's helping people to live a God-honoring life. And the Bible does talk about, does it not? We don't use the word much anymore, but the old way that the theologians referred to it was mortification. What is the doctrine of mortification? We talk about being mortified, right? What does mortified mean? I was mortified, someone saw me doing, whatever. I walked into a room and whatever. We're mortified. We were embarrassed. Okay, that's not what I mean by mortification. Think more like mortician. Yeah, to mortify means to put to death sin in your life. Okay? And the Bible talks about that, doesn't it? Put sin to death. And how there is a struggle in all of that. And so we're not saying that people who would wrestle with some of these issues, we're not saying it's going to be easy. And we should have much compassion for them, even as we have compassion for ourselves and for others who struggle with whatever it is that we struggle with. There's so many people in this world who struggle with anger issues. It's just like, that's the besetting sin. I just flare up. And so you're called to mortify that in your life. Okay? So, but what this is banning is, they've got this definition. What they're really saying is that, if someone comes to you and says, I don't want to live this way, you can't help them. It goes on then, change a person's gender expression. So this is what's called conversion therapy. To change a person's gender expression so that it conforms to the sex assigned to a person at birth. Okay? Repress or reduce non-heterosexual attraction or sexual behavior. So again, someone comes to you, and you're a counselor, and they say, I want to repress, I want to reduce these attractions I'm feeling, I want to live a chaste life, I want to live a God-honoring life. Repress a person's non-cisgender gender identity. So the cross-dresser says, I don't want to be a cross-dresser anymore, and I want help with this, and my mind doesn't think right on these issues, and you can't help them. Repress or reduce a person's gender expression that does not conform to the sex assigned to the person at birth. Then it goes on to state, anyone who knowingly causes another person to undergo such therapy, including by providing conversion therapy to that person, is guilty of an indictable offense and liable to imprisonment for a term of not more than 5 years. Then they have a section promoting or advertising. Anyone who knowingly promotes or advertises conversion therapy is guilty of an indictable offense and liable to imprisonment for a term of not more than 2 years. So that includes putting in your bulletin an announcement. Anyone who receives a financial or other material benefit, knowing that it is obtained or devised directly or indirectly from the provision of conversion therapy, is guilty of an indictable offense and liable to imprisonment for a term of not more than 2 years. So you're handing out material from a Christian biblical worldview. This gets pretty darn close to preaching from Romans chapter 1, doesn't it? Because Romans chapter 1 is definitely calling you to forsake a lifestyle, to live a different kind of lifestyle. And so some of the articles, this is the bill, this is law in Canada. Okay, this is not something they're discussing or debating. This is the law of the land in Canada. And Canada has I don't remember what they call it, but a declaration of liberties that is not unlike our Bill of Rights. And religious liberty is one of those declarations that's guaranteed in Canada. And this bill denies religious liberty. Again, it is a totalitarian position that says only one way of thinking is allowed. You don't have the freedom to live out of your worldview convictions. So, the threat here is not only to Canadian pastors, which is a very real threat, and I've got an article now, which I don't have the time to read all of this, but it's quoting Canadian pastors, and the word totalitarian is in this article several times. And these are pastors who are saying, we're in the crosshairs here, and we're going to be punished for our teaching, for our preaching, for our counseling. And they're willing to pay the price because they don't feel they have any other option. The last thing we should do with this is say that, well, this is Canada, so it doesn't really concern us. Because what's in Canada doesn't stay in Canada. There's one pastor here, and he is Polish by his background, and so he grew up in the Eastern Bloc world. And here's a quote. He says, Bill C-4 is straight, quote, from Soviet Russia. And it really does make you think along those lines. A dark wave of hostility against Christians and the Christian worldview. So those are two issues. It's the same issue, one at a national level, one at the level of a small Midwest community. But those are things that we need to be aware of, and we need to do what we can to push back on those And, part of the good news, though, is that we do see, I think, sort of an arising, and it's a grassroots kind of thing, with parents and school board meetings, and we've got a guy here. Dan, you want to share what you're doing tomorrow?
Well, there's a Hermiston School Board that is having a listening session tomorrow, so it's the second one that they've done. And it's good, it's just an opportunity for parents to speak, and they listen. And we went to the first one, it wasn't very well attended, and I suspect it won't be that well attended this time. I brought up critical race theory, I asked about critical race theory on the first one, and then for this one I want to read it. I want to bring up some of the transgender things. So I want to use the Leah Thompson story kind of to sort of introduce it. So I made a statement that I'll read, but anyway, that's what's happening.
But that's a little thing. I told Dan when. No, I know it. Let me finish. Let me finish. No, I was going to say it's a little thing. It's something that I personally, because Dan brought this to the elder council. He said, what do you guys think about me doing this? And we all said, you should do this. And I said, I guess it was Thursday morning when he brought this up, so there were a few other folks in the room as well. But I said to Dan, personally, that's the sort of thing that for me to do that would be very difficult. I mean, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go into that environment and read a statement like that, because it takes courage, it takes conviction. You might have someone who doesn't like it, who's mad at you. I get up before you all and I say the things that I say, but I realize that, this is a group of people who are going to think pretty much like I do, and you're going to be pretty much on the same page with me, and it's a supportive environment. It takes courage to do that. It's a small thing, but it's a small thing that needs to be happening everywhere in our country. And so all those little acts become a big deal if people will stand up and do those things.
I got two questions. What time is the meeting?
Good question. 6 maybe.
My second question is, how many of us are going to be there? And you watch what's going on in Canada.
Yeah.
Those drivers are, wasting their fuel, they're doing all of that. But you look at the people that are standing on the overpass and supporting them. So are we going to stand on the overpass when he's driving by?
Yeah. Now, I won't be there because I'm teaching at CR tomorrow at 6. But what Lloyd is saying is a valid point. So where does this meeting take place?
It's in the district office, yeah, so it used to be a grocery store.
Okay, so it's over on the other side of town. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe it's 6, but it's on Facebook.
So if you can, I think what Lloyd is saying is it'd be a good thing to go and just provide moral support for Dan. Right? That's what you're saying.
Yeah, because I will tell you that people sit in meetings and listen to speakers and think, oh, that's just it.
Mm-hmm.
So we're echo. I mean, we could go too, but we're echo. Who in here is Hermiston that's wanting to be there?
And we don't have poor kids in the school
The thing
district.
is, yes, you're echo, but a lot of things that happen in Hermiston, it fans the flames into the smaller communities. If we can stand behind Hermiston squashing critical race, our littler schools are less likely to adopt it also.
Hey, when we have a fire out here, whoever gets there first takes care of it, if they need help, everybody else gets up too.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a small thing. Let me say something more. In the sense that the game last night, there were a bunch of players on the court, and several of them did a significant small thing at the right moment. Like that one guy, he's 33, what's his name? There was one rebound that he got, and he came down with that ball and kind of, yeah, he just, you could see that was a moment, and he was a man going after that ball. It was a small thing. It was just one moment, one rebound. But I'm sure it helped inspire the crowd. The crowd went nuts. And in that game, there were so many things like that where one player at one moment made a key free throw or made a key pass that got a layup. And all those little things came together. A lot of these kids were just sort of average Stanfield basketball players, but they had that one moment where they did something significant, and it made a difference. The game was won. So those little things, if we stand up and do those things, it is important.
How do we find out for sure what time it's out?
Meeting is tomorrow night at 6 o'clock in Emerson School District office, as by their website. I'm just looking at it.
Okay.
And I understand that video though, so if you can't be there, you could watch. I mean, that's not quite the same thing, but
Yeah.
Just another note of maybe encouragement, and it's not here locally so much, but it is out in Pendleton. There is a mass of Pendleton, not only parents, but teachers who have withdrawn their kids from school to the point where Pendleton is stepping down the league in sports next fall.
They're going 5A to 4A.
They're going from 5A to 4A, and it is kind of driven by the stuff we're talking about here today. The parents and the teachers are like, enough is enough, we're going to teach our own kids.
Yeah.
And we're going to remove them from that. I think that's encouraging.
Yeah. Yeah, here's another way to think of this small things. What we're doing in this Sunday school hour for the last year or so, it's a small thing. We're a relatively small church. Based on church statistics, we're not that small, because the average church is 60 people. But, churches are small. It's a small thing. But what if every evangelical, Bible-believing, conservative church, we could throw Catholics in too, what if every church had something like this, Sunday by Sunday, talking through issues and encouraging their people to do what they can in their sphere of influence to make a difference. So it's a small thing, but sometimes small things can make a difference. So, well, we need to close in prayer. So, do I have a volunteer to pray for Dan? So Dan can't pray.